There are certain parts about this movie. First, the initial part of the movie is actually difficult to concentrate on. You find it a collage of disjointed facts, kind of very difficult to concentrate. The real concentration starts in the movie with the entry of Silva. That is where you are really focused onto the movie. Second part, we always see James Bond as a kind of Western Rajnikant, the projection of omnipotence, who knows everything, who cannot be defeated, who would crack and solve every problem successfully. And some of the stunts that you see, they are typical Rajnikant stunts. So in that sense, he is a Oxford Cambridge returned Rajnikant. In this movie, you see a different kind of Bond. And some commentators have said this movie makes Bond undergo a midlife crisis. And the midlife crisis is a very important component, which is mentioned quite often in the movie, that you are getting old now. And midlife is a crisis which usually happens around 42, or in some cases 42 to 45, where a complete reorientation happens. You start off your life at 25 with a lot of dreams. And when you are at 42 or 45, you know some of them have not come true and are not likely to come true. And this brings in an element of mourning. It's a very difficult phase for everyone to accept that we have to let go of certain very important desires which are difficult to let go. Second, mortality becomes a fact. We see our parents dying or about to die. We see some other people around us dying, and we also start feeling sick because the body doesn't work any longer as it used to. You can't forget the body. And therefore, sickness and mortality become a fact. So till midlife, we can use denial to say that it happens to everyone else but not me. But after midlife, this becomes a fact. You can no longer push it aside. And then it's like those um, old time watches where you would put sand in an inverted funnel and the sand would be flushing out of the funnel. So we feel that time for us is limited now. The sand is falling down the funnel and only limited time that is left for us. And this becomes a fact. Till then, you can deny death, you can deny sickness, you can deny weakness. But after midlife, they become facts. Now, something important happens in midlife. That on one hand, there is this very disturbing, deep mourning process. That what cannot be had and what can never be had, you have to undergo a mourning, and that's a lot of dreams. Because we all start with a cargo of dreams at 25, and at 45 or 42, when we know that 75% of the cargo is not going to be realized, it's not an easy thing to undergo that mourning. And this often brings in the depressive phase in life. Jung talks about it very importantly. He calls it the stroke of the noon. He says the sun goes up, stays at the top, and then starts going down. The peak is the midlife, and then it's going to go down. And he says this is the stroke of the sun. And he says the values which govern the first half and the second half are very different. And midlife is an opportunity to plan the second innings. Because the first innings, by and large, is a product of impulse and social situation. But the second half can be more planned. So this is actually an opportunity to plan the second innings. In this movie, Bond undergoes that midlife crisis. And like it happens in midlife, you go back in time to integrate difficult parts of yourself. And Bond goes back to his home, the Skyfall. And this happens in real life also. Just after you touch 40, people start making the schoolboy reunion again. You forget till 40, but after you are 40, you start making those WhatsApp groups again. You start reconnecting. So on this, I had a discussion, lecture on my channel. It's called Man Has to Go Back. That we have to go back to integrate difficult parts of ourselves. And therefore, revisit is not a waste of time. It's an investment of time. And we all have to go back to reintegrate. So Bond also does that. So one of the interpretations of this movie has been from some critics that this is a Bond's midlife crisis movie. Now coming to, there can be other interpretations also, but let me take up the interpretation I have taken up. I look at this movie, and there are many ways to look at this movie. One way that I will take up today is to look at Skyfall as a story of loss and ruins. There are two important words, loss and ruins. And the important part is all the three major characters of the movie have early life loss in their personalities. And all of them are living in ruins, ruins of different types, but ruins all the same. Silva literally lives in ruins, the abandoned island, which we can literally make it out. But there's another form of ruins, which is the sophisticated, grand, technological ruins. So we have this whole techno civilization, which is grand in nature, but psychologically speaking, it looks like a ruin. A high-tech ruin, but still a ruin all the same. And MI6 and all the uh, glamorous malls that you see in the movie, they all represent in some sense the grand ruins. And this is something which was uh, foreseen by philosophers like Nietzsche and Heidegger. That the way techno civilization is building up and the way we are losing connect with nature, mythology, tradition, and community, very soon we will be a isolated, lonely set of people. And we will be living in grand technical marvels, but psychologically will feel like a ruin. That you can have a touch button, touch screen for everything, but you still feel you're living in the ruins. And therefore, the word ruins has to be reinterpreted in the larger context, not only the literal ruins, but also the psychological ruins. So I would go on these two paths today, the story of loss and the story of ruins. So let me go person by person as to how each of the three, Bond, Silva, and M, are products of loss and how they are coping with loss in different ways and how the nature of loss is different. And then let us go to ruins. Uh, I have sent you the PPT on your phone if you want to see. I can't project it because it's difficult to connect it. So I can see it on my laptop. You can see it on your mobile. Dhruval, you have to forward it. I don't have your forward कर दीजिए इनको.
Just to add, when you're talking about the ruins and technology, right? So it's almost like in the face of modernity, there's this the ruins that we all are actually subjected to living.
Very well made
So,
point.
so
Actually, these are the ruins of modernity.
yeah, I was just thinking because technically on exactly on that line.
You have hit a very good point because this is where the macro and the micro come together. The historical and the psychoanalytic come together. And I'll touch upon this point of how psychoanalysis, which is supposed to be a micro discipline, is linked to much larger disciplines, which usually we don't link it to. But you are right. It the ruins are the ruins of modernity. That just as modernity, the era that started with the Industrial Revolution, just as that is coming to an end, the with the closure of modernity, we are seeing these ruins left behind by this historical era. Like every historical era builds something and leaves behind something. So if we look at the Western civilization, we'll find the Greek era, then we'll find the Christian era, then we'll find the Industrial Revolution, the modern era. And now, as the modernity closes, right, we'll get into a new era, but modernity leaves in its wake certain achievements and certain difficulties. One of the difficulties it leaves behind is the psychological ruins. We'll go into details of the ruins in a moment. Okay. Let me just start with the quote by Meltzer. It's a very good quote. He says, if it is not autobiographical enough, it's not psychoanalytic enough. So, in some sense, it will be autobiographical. The story will depict the screenwriter's unconscious or the director's unconscious, but today we'll keep it aside. Some other day we can discuss that part as to how it can be a product of the screenwriters or writers or the director's unconscious, whoever finalized the story, and how it is linked to his own inner personal life. That can be another way of looking at the book. To go into the unconscious of the creators. What we are doing today is a second way of looking at the movie analysis, looking at the movie as an independent art product, right? Independent of the creator, and just focusing on the art product. Okay. So let's look at the story of loss of James Bond. There are three stories of loss: James Bond, Silva, and M. First, if you compare the loss of James Bond and the loss of Silva, what can we make out from a psychoanalytic standpoint? Uh, Not exactly. Uh, Bond is an orphan, definitely. Silva may have lost his parents, we don't know, but it would be much later because he mentions in the movie that when he was a child, he along with the parents would go to that island, grandmother's island, which was like a paradise. Until then, the parents were there with him. But we don't know when the parents went away. That is, we are not told in the story. But there's definitely loss of some time. The question is when. And this brings us to a very important element of a real loss and a perceived loss, which psychologically are the same. And this is very important. Like uh, Bond's loss seems to be a post-Oedipal loss. In the sense, the superego already is integrated to some extent. The phallic capability and belief in oneself is already integrated to some extent. But Silva's loss makes him more fragile. It makes him it very difficult for him to integrate the superego. His superego is severely compromised. One way of looking at it would be superego pathology, because it's a complete antisocial psychopathic spectrum. So what we can say from our theoretical stuff is uh, Bond lost his parents somewhere around the post-Oedipal age, after the Oedipus. We are not given exact dates, but we can make a surmise based upon our theory. Whereas Silva's loss is a pre-Oedipal loss. And there is a world of difference between pre-Oedipal and post-Oedipal losses. The fragility in the pre-Oedipal loss will be very high. And more primitive mechanisms will be at work. So you can see in Silva, the mechanism of fusion is at work. He wants to fuse back to the mother. That only you can end it for both of us. So that we both die together here and now with a single bullet. And then we are together forever. And this is the dynamic of fusion. And often you have narcissistic mothers who uh, develop a fused relationship with their daughters or sons. They are never able to separate. And this also is something which makes them very fragile. So two things about Silva we can say which makes him very different from Bond. One, his losses are very early, far more primitive. Two, superego could never be completely integrated. And three, uh, he talks about going to the island with the parents, right? Which seems to have gone on for quite some time because he was old enough to really participate in that rat catching and everything. Which means his loss was actually perceived, not real. An orphan's loss is real. But let us say there is a child and the mother falls sick, or somebody else in the family falls sick, or somebody has a social function and the mother is not available to the child, or the mother is working and goes to work after 3 4 months of conceive of delivery and starts going to work. Now, a child at 4 to 5 months of age would see that as abandonment, and that would produce far worse results than the same thing happening at 7 years of age or 8 years of age when one can understand what is happening. So Silva's loss seems to be loss of that type, that there is a very early life loss, a perceived loss, and the real loss may have happened much later. But what is at work is the very early life loss, and the perceived loss did not be weaker than the real loss. Often it's actually even more stronger than the real loss. So the nature of loss is different. Now, how does each of them cope up with it? Let's look at Bond. The lost nature is a post-Oedipus. And this is happening in constitutionally a heterosexual personality. Whereas in case of Silva, the loss is happening pre-Oedipal and in the context of a potentially constitutionally bisexual personality. And that also makes the outcome of loss quite different. Because he would go into the Oedipus with already a pre-Oedipal problem in a context of bisexual personality. And therefore, the question of passing through the Oedipus successfully is very low. Probability is very low. And this is what happens that when you have a pre-Oedipal problem, you automatically watch up the Oedipus because you're already going there impaired. And this also we can see in therapy, that in therapy, more and more pre-Oedipal material comes in rather than the Oedipal material coming. One would be the resistance to Oedipus because of defenses, but the second is that is also where the healing actually has to happen and the unconscious takes us there. The third part is he has internalized a healthy superego, but what the loss does to him is avoidance of emotional closeness. And he defends the drive towards love by a defense of sex. That the drive for love and attachment is covered up by a layer of sexuality which is fused with a lot of aggression. So his sexuality is not a soft, uh, somber kind of sexuality. It's a sexuality with a lot of aggression fused into that sexuality. And he avoids emotional closeness. That because once bitten, twice shy, once he attached strongly to his parents and lost the parents, and the pain was so high, the template was built up never again. And that never again is at work in the adult personality. Then we find the search for good parents in both of them. Both of them are in search of the perfect parent. And the seemingly perfect parent obviously is not perfect, but the seemingly perfect parent figure who appears, that person is manipulative in one sense, cold and manipulative. She's not evil, but she is not idealistic either. She is classical of what you rightly mentioned, what is called in literature the refrigerator mother, the cold mother. Very hard to please, and people keep trying to please. And this happens in many relationships, that you are trying to please somebody difficult to please. And if you had such an experience in the childhood, you will select such a person out of many who is difficult to please and waste your time trying to please. And that is how the unconscious will repeat itself. Ki, uh, there is an old saying, ki, because she is available, I am not interested. And there's a Woody Allen joke. I will never accept membership of a club which accepts people like me as members. It's that kind of a impossible desire that I want to please somebody who cannot be pleased. I want to have somebody who cannot be had. The moment the person is available, I'm not interested. Right? So I'm interested in a perpetually impossible desire. So that is one component of it. But both of them are in search of good parents. And where both of them find at one time is in England as the father figure and M as the mother figure. So both of them find the father figure and the mother figure in England and M respectively. Now, both of the parents are manipulative. England also manipulates them, and the mother also manipulates them. But they find it. In Bond, what we see is a series of psychic maneuvers. Like the loss leads to rage. The loss leads to rage. But the rage by superego is turned at the service of the nation. So we see how it gets sublimated by a social structure. That there is a loss leads to rage. But the rage is sublimated by the superego to be at the service of the country. And this would be the dynamic of many people in the armed forces. That there would be something early life, either a loss or pent up anger towards the parents, but somehow high aggression. And that high aggression is turned by the superego at the service of the country. It gets sublimated. And you can see some of the episodes on YouTube of special forces operatives. There are many of them now. The Indian special forces operatives who have retired, they narrate. And you can see a very classical Kleinian presentation there at their unconscious of kill or be killed. It's operating in them. And that's the reason they go into special forces. They can't be content even in the ordinary army. Okay, I always want to be in operations. I always want to be in the situation of kill or be killed. I don't want a peacetime posting. That's where a few from the army go to the special forces. Right? The split is open and compelling the man to action. The loss and the rage towards M in case of Bond is turned inwards. When M asks the girl to take a shot and Bond falls, right, there is a lot of rage towards M. But the rage towards the mother figure cannot be expressed because that would result in a loss. And with this, we always see that people prefer to harm themselves than to suffer loss. That loss is most difficult to bear. Many people bear abusive relationship in preference to a loss. That the vacuum is more difficult than attack. Huh? No objective. Yeah. So there are two hierarchies. Right? Some people have this hierarchy: good relation, no relation, bad relation. Some people have this hierarchy: good relation, bad relation, no relation. So for the first, right, loss is acceptable, attack is not acceptable. For the second, attack is acceptable, loss is not acceptable. Loss is more terrifying than attack. So they will say, keep me in an abusive relationship, but don't leave me. Right? So for him, the rationalization, right, makes that go inward. And you see in the movie, one of the scenes is he cuts open an old wound. That is when after the encounter with M and he does not see any remorse, right, that anger again activates and turns back on himself, cannot go towards her. because he won't lose his mother figure, he won't lose his job. So he turns back. Uh, the loss has also led, in a way, has not disturbed in Bond the love for life or the lust for life. I should not say this. Let me say, put it this way. The lust for life is there, but the love for life has been disturbed. That the loss has sort of devalued life, diminished the hope, devalued life, and therefore is ready to take the risk. In one of the Bond movies, he tells M makes a criticism and he says, don't worry, the life of a Bond is very short. You don't have to regret for long. And you take up this kind of a life because you are ready to take risk because you don't value life so much. And that comes out of loss and rage of very early life. Then he talks about the roller coaster of life and the hobby of resurrection. In the movie, he says, what is your hobby? And he says, resurrection. So he takes the roller coaster of life, but he is hopeful because before the loss happened, the experience was very good. This is also an important element, that when the loss happens, before that what happened and after that what happened. Before loss, if you had very good experience, then you already have some positive fortitude to process that loss. Say, for example, the mother was always available for 2 years and then the loss happened, perceived loss. Mother fell sick for 3 months, let us say, or started going to work. So you already have 2 years of good experience with the mother and then the loss. But let us say the loss happens at 2 months of age. It's a terrible loss. So this is what we see, that pre-loss, right? The actual loss, and then post-loss, what happens? Post-loss, if people around you behave in a way so as to minimize the effect of the loss, again it has an impact. But in most cases, unfortunately, we see people actually multiply the outcomes of loss. So it gets fortified in the personality. Uh, that loss and the outcomes of it are constantly the ache inside Bond, and what he does is recreation, sexuality, risk, and finally what heals him in midlife is he gets into return to his home. He returns to his home and he regains the mother and the father. So if you look at Skyfall, his home, right? He is back to his home, and there he has got back the mother and the father figures, the old man and M, right? And he's again like a child, but this time the experience is different. The attackers come, and last time when it happened, he was helpless child, he hid inside, and the parents were killed. This time he is able to fight it, and that guilt and that shame is overcome. That sadness is overcome. So he relives the childhood in a positive rendition of the child. And that reconstruction and reliving of a childhood in a different way helps him to heal. So this is one part of the lost story of James Bond.
There was that part, right, when he goes back to Skyfall. The old man says that he entered into that chimney tunnel, and he said he entered then as a boy and he turned into a man.
Adult. When he came out, he was no longer a boy.
He was no longer a boy. That was also it was a transition.
So that was a time of trauma.
Yeah.
Those days that he was inside was exactly when the trauma was getting built and changing him. Initially, it was trauma, and then the defense mechanisms came in. And after the defense mechanisms came in and a new persona was created, he came out a completely different person. And this is what would happen in most traumatic situations. That initial trauma would be unbearable, defenses would be mobilized, they will come in and they will create some structure to cope with the trauma. And the structure usually is a symptom or a problem. Right? So in many cases, what we call a problem is an attempt at a dysfunctional solution. That what we diagnose as a problem is actually a way of avoiding a more severe problem. And often that can become a hindrance to the healing of the problem. I mean, in personality disorder, you see this very clearly. That the man is hanging by the rope of the problem and you say, let him go. How can he let it go? Because if he lets it go, he'll fall into the valley, which is worse than the personality disorder you're talking about. So the personality disorder's rope he's hanging by. Right? And we want him to let go of it. I mean, he can't let go of it. Nobody can. So unless the valley is filled up, right, he won't let go of the rope. So this is where the Bond's traumatic experience inside that chamber would be there. Now let us come to the story of loss of Silver. His loss is earlier than that of James Bond and more likely to be perceived rather than real. And this brings up a very important element that the perceived losses are no less in intensity than the real ones. In fact, they can be even worse than the real ones if they happen early enough. And he has had a mother who never allowed him to be an individual. She was always fused with him. And that is the way he knows to be, which is very different from Bond's interaction with the mother. From their adult personality, we can make out what must have happened in early childhood. Right? That Bond would have experienced a mother who allows him to be an individual, separate from her and grow up in a healthy way. Whereas in Silva's case, it would be a mother who is fused with the child, who would not allow the child to grow up as an individual separate from her, because she would have her own abandonment, narcissistic, and domination issues. And that would make for the child very difficult for the child not to be in fusion with somebody. And this we see in the last scene where he says, only you can end it for us. Why don't you set me free? Why don't you set free both of us? Because we are fused. And the only way we can be defused is by dying. And in that sense, we'll be again together forever and there will be no loss. So the loss of the fusion often takes this form, that the man wants to go back and fuse back, even if it means death. That thereafter will always be two again. Another difficulty with fusion is this key. In fusion, there's a different kind of intensity and authenticity and safety, which you don't find in well-built boundary individual relationships. What we call healthy, right? The two individuals with safe boundaries, strong boundaries are interacting with each other. They don't have that kind of intensity. They don't have that kind of authenticity. There's too much of politics involved. I mean, I'm talking in a generic way, not in the electoral politics way, but there's too much of defenses involved. You are not completely open to the other. There are too many do's and don'ts based upon calculations which are between two people. I mean, there would be hardly very few people who would be completely honest to each other. In Chinese, there is a saying, if everyone was to know what everyone else thinks, there won't be three friends left in this world. So it's that kind of thing. Okay, given this fact, we all have to say something and hide something, say something truly, package something and say it. So that kind of a politics always is on between two people, and that reduces the honesty, the authenticity, and the intensity which is there in fusion. Even without that honesty, even if they are lying to each other at an affective level, there is this authenticity, there is this safety, and there is this fusion. And there is this tendency that it's only you and me, we both of us are complementing each other, and we don't need anybody else in the world. Only you and me forever together and no one else in the world. That is the typical drive for fusion, and that we see in Silva. That he gets obsessed with her out of two things. One is out of adult experience of revenge because he was betrayed. So he is obsessed with her partly out of revenge, which any man would be. But he is obsessed with her far more than any man would be. Because anyone else would just look at killing her and be off it. He would not do this whole thing of only you and me together and you can end it. That is coming from the fusion. And that also holds him back, because when he has to shoot her, he hesitates, and Bond gets time to come in. So he hesitates to shoot her because of that projection of the mother figure. That at some level, he is relating to her as a mother figure, just as Bond is. But his relation with the mother was a fused relationship, and therefore the hesitation is more. And this whole dramatic ending is there. Okay, now one bullet, both of us go, and we are then forever together. Right? So, one part. Second part is the bisexuality in the personality. That can also lead to rage. But if you look at him, there's a very interesting scene. He's trying to seduce Bond in a homosexual way. And when Bond says this is not the first time for him, he suddenly backs off. And he talks about how physical things are secondary. If you look at the dialogues, meaning that there is a bisexual component to the personality, but the narcissistic component is much higher. And he is using the bisexual component in a way to score points. Not that he is not actively living it out, he must be living it out somewhere. But with Bond, we see this in that particular interaction. It is used more to score a point rather than to actually uh, get pleasure sensually by doing. So that bisexuality becomes at the service of power rather than pleasure of its own sake. Then we look at the paradise lost. That in case of Silva, there was a paradise lost. The paradise was infested by rats. And he is, as an adult, he is trying to re-establish the paradise, and he actually did it by getting an island. What he lost as a grandmother's island, as an adult, he drew out everybody and got the island for himself. But he no longer lives in that green, lush island. He is now living in the island of ruins. He could have turned it into a green island. He does not. He finds himself more at home in the ruins because there is a nostalgic quality to it. And he is living primarily in the past. This happens many times, that when you don't have much to see in future, hopefully, and this is not hopefully in the outer sense of the word. This is not that you are a VP and you cannot become a CEO. In the outer world, you can, but that is not what you really long for. Deep inside, what you really long for, that is never going to come. And that leads to a deep disappointment and resignation. And then you start living in the nostalgic past rather than in the future. So we see here a person who is passing through that, who is living in the nostalgic past and not in the future. This I would know firsthand by my own experience, because I often nostalgically go to my school, my childhood school, to the place I used to live. And every time I go there, I feel nostalgic and I feel a bit of me more integrated. And there's a different quality of being there in a nostalgic sense. And this possibly is because I don't see uh, great hopes of something that I deeply like in future. So when you have that situation, you go back in the past. Will Durant said it very clearly. He said, uh, the young live in the present, the young live in the future, the working middle age, they live in the present, and the old live in the past. So in that sense, in a psychological sense, I feel I have gone old because I'm living in my past. So that often happens. And I think post midlife, it happened to me more strong, this living in the past. And that brings a very different dynamic to the mind. Coming back to this one, uh, if you look at talent, talent in him is much better than Bond. So talent can come in any kind of personality, no matter how traumatic damage the personality might have endured. You can see some people with great psychosis being great artists. We also know in history some great artists were psychotic, and some of them even killed themselves in their bout of psychosis. So talent can go in strange combinations, and we see him more talented than Bond. Uh, One important point here is only you can heal me. And this is something very important I would like to touch upon. Uh, in fusion, often you find this, that there is need for a particular kind of personality. Let me give an example and come back to it. One of the psychoanalytic masters, Wilfred Bion, he had this real life story. He was a deeply traumatized person. I mean, obviously, only then you can create a school of psychoanalysis. So he was a deeply traumatized person. And he underwent analysis twice with very famed psychoanalytic personalities who were masters themselves in their own right. And he underwent quite long analysis. Yet certain issues were buried deep inside. He married the first time, and yet they remained. He married the second time, and somehow with his second wife, he could find that safety. And there are certain issues that he could deal with, he could speak about, he could heal himself only in the presence of the second wife. And this brings in that element. Uh, Jung also used to mention it. He used to say, we are all in search of that figure, the eternus femininus and the eternus masculinus. That a woman is in search of the eternus masculinus, and the man is in search of the eternus femininus. That perfect woman who will give me everything, including my healing. And therefore, this comes about that only you can heal me. Only you can heal me. Meaning, there is certain sort of persona. If that persona comes in my life, only then I can be healed. Now, what happens is when this is the situation that we see in therapy, then the therapy has to wait for life experiences to happen. There are things outside of the room which have to happen for something good to happen in the room. Because we are stuck in a situation where the outside experience we are waiting and we are stuck. And when that person comes into the life of the person or some event happens, then the real arrest is sort of lubricated, it is undone, and the movement starts. So it is very important, only you can heal me. So this is where the life experience comes in the healing of therapy. That often we wait for that life experience. Therapy waits for that life experience. And in this case, the you was M. And this can be true for many people in personality disorders, that they would have in their mind, if you really talk to them, that what kind of person in your life, if he or she was to be, you feel you will be healed. And they will have an idea of that person. And often that will be a superhuman idea. But a part of it can be present in the living person. And that is where, even if that person is partly that kind, the healing can start. So that is very important here. Only you can heal me. I think this is a very important component in many situations. And for many, those who are in search of the one. Third one, the story of loss of N. What is her story? It is a loss of a much later time. And it is a loss of the nature of loss is such, looking at her personality, it is more of a secondary narcissism loss rather than loss of a person per se. That's very different. A cold person in front of you and no person in front of you are two different things. No person in front of you is a total loss. A cold person in front of you is a deep recoiling from the one you are trying to attach. It's a cold other, the refrigerator other. So there, the person is present, but the person is cold. So two things happen. Your warm attachment goes to the person. The person refuses to reciprocate. It turns back and creates a secondary narcissism inside of you. Because the relationship attempt failed. And therefore the libido has to go back to oneself. And the attachment and love which was to be with that person now is with oneself. Second, what is present in front of you for a long time you internalize, and therefore a cold mother is internalized, and you also develop that coldness. You also develop that hard to please part inside of you. So you can get that from M, the way she is, what happened in her childhood. But she is, in that sense, not the idealistic type, not the poetic type. Her constitution is more practical. She is an organizational climber. She knows how to socially climb, how to organizationally climb. She is the practical type. She is the worldly wise. She is not the simple type that Bond is, or the extreme poetic and pathological type that M is, the Silva is. She is the worldly wise person, a practical person, a calculative person who knows how to climb up the organization, who knows how to be patient, and who also knows how to manipulate people, manage people, control people, and use them and throw them when the need be. So, in that sense, her superego is also severely compromised. But her superego is morally correct, morally wrong and legally correct. It's a different kind of a superego. Right? So, legally, you can't say anything. Legally, she's completely correct, and morally, she's wrong many places. So, it's a very different kind of a superego, right? It is not a guilt-led superego, it's a shame-led superego. There is a guilt component. She's not antisocial. But the guilt component is less. What will society say? That shame component is higher. So that way, it's very different kind of personality. You also see some bisexuality in her personality, very strong masculinity. And that comes out even in the appearance and the way she does, and even the work she has chosen. It's a very masculine job that she has chosen for herself. Uh, this is a loss in a constitution of a personality which is very reality oriented, very pragmatically oriented, not somebody who is living in the dreams. So in reality fantasy proportion, it's a personality very high in reality, very less on fantasy. Loss is not too deep for emotional closeness. She is able to have a husband, she is able to have a family, and so on. But that calculation and the coldness shows in one of the Bond movies, her daughter is kidnapped and she lets go of the daughter for the sake of England and for the sake of job. She will not compromise and do something the criminal wants, even when the daughter is going to die. And that is where the daughter falls in love with the criminal. And there's a complete movie on this, a one of the Bond movies. Yeah, I think I don't remember, but there is a very famous Bond movie on this. Her daughter in that movie uh, tries to capture her and punish her for this. Just as Silva is trying to do it, her own daughter in another movie tries to do the same thing. So the same thing, even at home, continues. Uh, she has moved from loss to little guilt, and at last you see there is guilt and reparation. She reconciles to the fact that certain wrong things have happened, right? And she tries in her own way to do reparation, but she is not used to it. And therefore, it's almost like a half step taken for reparation. That she says something and about to say and does not say it. So that kind of thing we see. So these are the three lost stories. Now let us come to the ruins. What the ruins are about. Silva literally lives in the ruins. There is no question about it. M lives in very high-tech ruins. And James, the MI6 is a high-tech ruin. Right? And James Bond psychologically lives in the ruins of Skyfall. So all the three are living in different ruins. One of them knows it, two of them don't know it. And this is what happens when something what we say is the spirit of the age. That when the spirit of the age is such that most people are living in ruins, right? Then most of them don't know. It would take too deep an analysis to really figure it out. And most people neither have the interest nor the capability to really do it. And therefore, all the three characters are living in ruins in this movie. And therefore, we can say, in one sense, to generalize, everyone is living in the ruins. And this was first uh, theorized in writings by Nietzsche and Eliot. T.S. Eliot and T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, and Nietzsche wrote many. essays actually. One of the important elements was human all to human, in which he describes this. There is a very popular BBC episode on this. It's on YouTube, of Nietzsche, where he talks about the fall of the Christian civilization in the West. Okay? And he puts a question that till now it was the Bible which was right and wrong, and the stories of the Bible which were answering everything. Now that the Industrial Revolution has started and people are saying goodbye to it, what will be the morality of the new age? What will be the purpose of the new age? And therefore, he wrote a very famous statement. He said, God is dead and we are free. That because God is dead, we are free to decide what we want to make of ourselves. But this is a terrible thing because answers are not easy. When God was alive, answers were easy. Answers were in the Holy Book. Now, when the God is dead and we are free, the answers are very difficult. What will be the gold standard? What will be the morality? What will be the purpose? And he said that if we don't find the right one, we will get into a state of decay. And that is what actually happened. In the psychological and moral sense, existential sense, we entered into a state of decay. And therefore, we see the ruins. When the spirit of the age is of particular type, and this is where we connect the micro to the macro, then we see that the same thing is felt by many people and the same ideas come up in different areas of life. When something is felt deeply by many people, something will come up in literature, something will come up in philosophy, something will come up in psychology, something will come up in art. And when we see commonality in all these areas, it means it is talking about something in the air. It is the spirit of the times, which people in different areas are experiencing differently and articulating differently, but they say the same thing in some sense. And that is where we get into the spirit of the age. And that is where I would use the phrase that the idea travels through us. That we make a movie, and while making a movie, we don't have any idea of modernity, ruins of modernity, closure of modernity, but it speaks through the movie. Unknown to the creators, the idea speaks through the creator. And the same thing you find in many movies today. That the idea of ruins, and therefore this idea is speaking through us, unknown to us. That at a very deep level we are experiencing it. We are not able to analyze it or know it, but in different ways the idea is speaking through us. That is speaking through this movie also, just as it's speaking through many other movies. And this brings us to the micro and the macro. And one point I would like to put here is that when we look at psychoanalysis, usually we talk about the person, the mother, the father. It's actually a micro enterprise of a family. But we are not looking at the historical context. We are not looking at society, culture, the evolutionary history, and so on. So, in a sense, the boundaries of the system are very narrow. So, there is a width problem and there is a depth problem. That in width terms, we don't go beyond the family into society, culture, politics, culture, history, and so on, evolution, and so on. In depth terms, we don't get deeper to the epistemological level. We stop at the phenomenological level. So there are both these problems with psychoanalysis. Now, uh, one person who mentioned this was Kohut, and he used to say that the patients Freud used to get and the patients I get are very different, which means this is not something which is randomly happening. This is not that there is a genetic structure which is at fault and there is an environment which is constant and the two are interacting to create a pathology. It means that pathology has a very strong relation to culture. Like by the time Kohut came in, the hysteria patients were very less, practically negligible. Whereas Freud was overcrowded with hysteria patients, which means change in the culture will change the type of psychopathology which comes into the therapy room. So this is not something like a biological thing. It's very much a cultural thing. How psychopathology is manufactured, one of the strong elements is culture. It is not just the individual and the family. And this creates a very important element of what we can call the epidemiology of psychopathology. That culture plays a very important role in the epidemiology of psychopathology. And from a Jungian point, we can say the closure happens when they go into the old house and the old wise man they meet there. It's a very archetypal closure. It's a very archetypical closure that you go back to that old ruins of yesteryears and you meet the old wise man who is still there, the protector of the ruins. And only you can heal me happens. He is able to finally meet, and both of them actually die in some sense together. And therefore, the loss is undone. So, Silva heals himself. Right? He does not heal, he rather resolves the problem by re establishing a fusion in death. So, Bond heals himself by reliving the childhood with much greater resources. Silva heals himself, if you can call it healing, or at least resolves the problem by a fusion in death. He resolves the problem of fusion and loss by a refusion. Whereas M resolves her guilt partly by reparation and suffering. Because this happens in one sense in the church. So it is there that the guilt and the confession and the reparation for M in some sense happens. So this is how we can look at the story of loss and ruins. Just to recap the whole thing, what is Skyfall? Skyfall is the trauma. The sky falls upon the individual. The earth is taken out below his feet. That's the skyfall. The trauma is the real loss for him, perceived loss for the other, and an experienced loss in action for M. And then all of them are trying to cope up in different ways. And one more take in this can be I'm developing my own way of looking at the mind and therapy. It's called HEAT, Holistic Elemental Analysis and Therapy, in which we can slightly look at it differently, which we'll not go into today. But we can bring in elements of karma, self journey. We can bring in a different model of the mind, and we can look at the whole idea of the surreal, the real and the surreal, and holistic healing. And we can also go into generation of thought and generation of affect. Okay, what is the manufacturing process? The way thought gets manufactured and affect gets manufactured, and how that goes towards a symptom. And therefore, what can be the healing plan? We'll go some other time, not today, but this is it. Now, just take a look at the three pictures, and there is a story in pictures. Uh, you can take my phone. It's charged. Acha, acha, koi baat nahi. If you look at three pictures in the slide, they are very indicative. ये लीजिए एक्स्ट्रा है मेरा दत्ता ये लीजिए एक्स्ट्रा है. There are three pictures very symbolic. The first is of Skyfall, in which the antelope is on the top. Antelope is supposed to be a creature, very vivacious, very energetic, always full of life and energy running around. That is how originally it was. And then the trauma happens. And then the second picture talks about Bond. He walks out of Skyfall, and you can see the tree on the right of him. That is how his life becomes from inside. A very dry life, right? Non-juicy, emotionally dry. It's like a dry tree. So he walks out of Skyfall in that scene, and then he comes back for his own healing and rejuvenation. You see, the third picture is coming back to Skyfall. And then move to the next slide. This is the starting song when the movie is about to begin, and it's very symbolic. In fact, after this analysis, please see the song again. It will be very revealing. It says it's a song of truth for everyone. It says, "This is the end. Hold your breath and count to 10. Feel the earth move and then hear my heart burst again. For this is the end. I have drowned and dreamt this moment so overdue I owe to them. Swept away, I'm stolen." So this is completely a Bond story. I have drowned in that trauma and dreamt this moment of deliverance unconsciously over and over again. The healing is overdue. I owe them, my parents, what I have to do, and my own self, my own childhood swept away, I am stolen. And then let the sky fall. When it crumbles, we will stand tall, face it together, let the sky fall, and it goes on. Then go to the next slide. It's very important, the third paragraph. Skyfall is where we start. 1,000 miles and poles apart, where worlds collide and days are dark. You may have my number, you can take my name, but you will never have my heart. This is the classic outcome of resistance to emotional closeness. The drive for eros covered up by aggression, anxiety, and fear of emotional closeness. There is a one of my lectures on YouTube. It's titled "Lust at First Sight." So, lust at first sight is far more common than love at first sight. And the full title is "Lust at First Sight: Eros in Chains in Psychoanalysis." That we talk about it, but actually, love and eros are in chains in psychoanalysis. We don't talk much about it. Talk about lust, but not so much about love and eros. So there's the title of the thing. Sometime, if you feel like, go through it. Let the sky fall. Where you go, I go. What you see, I see. I know I would never be me without the security of your loving arms, keeping me from harm. Put your hand in my hand and we will stand. This is typically for both, as much for Bond as much for Silva. There is a flavor of fusion there. Let the sky fall. There is one more way of looking at the whole thing, the Kleinian way, where you say every character in the movie is a part of one mind. We'll not go into it today, but there is a way of looking at it. So with this, I will stop and open it up for questions.
Just a thought, since you touched upon this line, I'm quite curious. But what you call is fusion for Silva with the mother, the you say fusion in terms of diffusion. I felt it a little